In my early 20s, I moved to a new neighborhood. It was a quiet area not far outside of the city. My place was a small townhouse that was more than enough for me. The rent was affordable too, so I was happy to find it. It was just the main floor, with someone else's place up above. I had 2 bedrooms and an open space where the kitchen and living room were. There was just a single bathroom. It was just me though, so that was fine. The spare bedroom wasn't used for much. I was going to turn it into a guest room, but hadn't gotten around to it yet, so it was just a bare room at the time. There was a small closet on one end and a window on the other. I always kept that window closed and locked because I never used it. I had taken a job working nights at a local warehouse, which meant my sleep schedule was all over the place. Most days when I wasn't working, I found myself wide awake all night. There was no point in trying to sleep regular hours anyway, so I just embraced the nocturnal lifestyle. Since I was on strange hours, it made friendships tough to come by. I'm a pretty social person, but even after 4 months of living there, I still hadn't met most of my neighbors. My next door neighbors to the right were a young family who I only met once or twice. There was also a single guy a few years older than me, who I had never actually met. I had just seen him around once or twice. Other than that, the rest of them might as well have been strangers. One night, I was sitting on the couch, flipping through the TV channels. It was around 4 a.m., a time when pretty much everyone else would be asleep. Suddenly, I heard a creak. It was soft, but enough to make me curious. Like I said, I had a townhouse, so there would occasionally be noises from my neighbors. At this hour, though, it was rare. I decided to check it out, just to ease my mind, so I got up and walked through the house, but the sound didn't happen again. I checked the living room, the kitchen area, even the small bathroom. Nothing seemed out of place. I was about to head back to the couch when I looked into the spare room. There was something off about the window. I walked over and stood in front of it. The window, which I normally kept locked, was broken. The glass wasn't shattered, but the latch was broken, and it was clearly not shut all the way. I took a closer look at it, and when I inspected the screen, I could see a small slit that I didn't think was there before. I hadn't opened that window, and no one else should have either. At that moment, I was pretty sure that somebody had broken in. I didn't know if they were still in the house or if they had left. I ran to my bedroom to make sure nothing was stolen. The only real valuable thing that I had was my MacBook Pro, but it was sitting on my bed where I had left it. Although somewhat relieved, I knew now that it wasn't a robbery. If someone was still in the house, then there's no telling how long they had been there. I only noticed a slight creak, but there's no way I would have missed someone cranking open that window. It surely would have made a more serious noise. Maybe it happened when I was out, and the person was in my house somewhere, waiting for hours. I wasn't about to take any chances. I grabbed my phone and quickly left the house, locking the door behind me. Not that that would help anything. While I was walking down the street, I called the police. I waited out there, wondering what the hell was going on. Part of me thought I was going crazy, maybe too much coffee and sleepless nights. The police arrived after a while, and they went inside to check the house. After a few tense minutes, I watched them come back out. They had found someone inside, one of my neighbors. He was the guy who I had seen around, but never really talked to. The police said he seemed disoriented and confused, and that they found him in my bedroom closet. I thought he was drunk or something. They took him into custody, and I was left to piece together what had happened. Sleep was hard to come by for the next few days. A while later, I learned from the police that my neighbor claimed he had gotten drunk and mistook my house for his own. He had broken the window when he couldn't get in through the locked door. I think that's nonsense. If he came in by accident, then why did he hide in the closet? If he thought it was his own place, then he would have walked right in. That guy must have been there for hours with me, and the only sign of him was a slight creak and a broken window. I later found out that everyone in my neighborhood thought the guy was a creep as well. The break-in was a scary experience. I stayed in that place for almost a year after this happened, and that guy was still around when I left. It was weird seeing him on the streets, but neither of us ever said a word to the other. I'm 31 years old now, but this happened when I was 12 or 13. My family and I lived in a house in a middle-class neighborhood. It had 2 stories with a finished basement, so there was a lot of space for me, my brother, and my sister. My sister was 2 years older, and my brother was 1 year younger. Many of our neighbors had kids too. It was that kind of neighborhood. My best friend was only a few houses down, and my brother's best friend was right next door. The family across the street was a little older, so we didn't know their kids very well. We'll call them the Pattersons. There was a boy and a girl. The boy, who we'll call Darren, was a year out of high school at the time, but still living at home. The girl, who we'll call Sam, was a senior in high school. One thing was well known in our neighborhood, and that's that the Pattersons hated their next-door neighbors. I never found out who started it, but the families went at it like animals. The police were called more times than I can count, often for stupid minor things like noise complaints. The Pattersons even called the cops once because the dad thought someone dumped leaves on his lawn, but it was really just from the trees. The son Darren had a bad reputation in our area as well. My parents always told me not to talk to him, even though I was way younger and probably wouldn't have anyway. I don't know everything he was up to, but one event still stands out. One morning I was walking to the bus stop for school. I noticed that one of our electrical transformers was smashed. These transformers looked like big metal boxes on the side of the road. I honestly didn't know what they were at the time, but this one was in rough shape. I asked my parents about it, but they didn't know. Eventually I found out that Darren crashed his dad's car into it. The accident was caught on someone's security camera. Darren was arrested under suspicion of drunk driving because he was all over the road, swerving wildly. Unfortunately, he got off, because by the time the cops got to him, it was too late to test him. Another time, about a year later, I was at home alone for an afternoon. My dad was working, and my mom had left to take my sister somewhere. I was in my room upstairs doing some homework, with the TV on in the background. Then there was a knock on the small window next to our front door. That was weird, because most people would use the doorbell. I walked to the top of the stairs, where I could see down to where the noise came from. There was someone standing there, but from that angle, I couldn't tell who it was. I didn't bother going down, because the person looked too old to be one of my friends. I wasn't scared, just uninterested. I walked back to my room and picked up where I left off. About 2 minutes later, I heard another knock coming from the back of the house. It was on one of the windows by our deck. This time I walked down the stairs, because I was curious about who it was. When I turned the corner, the back windows came into view. I saw Mr. Patterson standing there on our back porch, looking in the window. This may not sound scary so far, but remember that our families were not friendly with each other. There was really no reason for him to come to our house, especially not into our backyard. I turned around and got out of sight as fast as possible. When I was in the other room, I was pretty sure that I could hear him try to open the door. I wanted to call my mom, but I knew she would be home soon anyway. I waited for another 10 minutes or so, and then her car pulled into the driveway. I told her what happened, and when my dad came home, we watched the footage on our security camera. It showed our neighbor walking up to our house, knocking on the window like I said. But the really creepy part is that it showed him trying to open the door, which was locked. Luckily he didn't break in or anything, but I was pretty scared. My dad went over to confront Mr. Patterson. He denied the whole thing at first, but when my dad screamed that he had video evidence, he just made up some BS excuse. He told my dad that he was checking on me. He said that I was too young to be left home alone, even though I was 13 and it was just for half an hour. Anyway, how would he have even known? Was he watching our house, waiting for me to be left alone? Things got better with them for a while. Nobody moved out until after I moved out, so those were my neighbors for the majority of my life. The son, Darren, ended up getting arrested a few years later. He had picked a fight on the street and gotten in trouble for assault and some other minor crimes. He didn't do any jail time. For how messed up the men were in the family, the mom always seemed really nice and normal. Same with her daughter. I didn't know Sam very well, but I would see her playing basketball on the driveway sometimes, and she seemed nice. That's about all I can say about the Pattersons. I don't know what he wanted in our house. I still have a hard time believing that he would actually hurt me, but why else would he try to sneak into our house while I was alone? I'm just glad the door was locked. This happened at my old apartment a few years ago. It was one of those new condo buildings downtown, the kind of place that looks like some modern art exhibit on the outside. It was basically all glass on the exterior, with balconies for every unit. I rented the place from a friend of mine, who bought the unit a few years out of college. She took a job in another city and decided to rent it out as an investment rather than selling. I was looking for a new place around that time, so it was a perfect fit for both of us. She gave me a good deal since we were friends, and she knew I would take good care of it. I knew some of the neighbors already from when I used to visit. Some of them were my age, and at first, it was like a little community. My place was on the 18th floor, and there was a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room. Off the bedroom was a small balcony, and there were windows on either side of it. Actually, every exterior wall was pretty much floor-to-ceiling windows. After the first year, my neighbor moved out. He was a quiet guy in his 30s that was nice enough. The guy who took his place was a little older, and he gave me a bad feeling right away. He had long hair and always wore a baseball hat. When he first moved in, I introduced myself and found out that his name was Liam. Liam worked from home, and I don't think he ever left other than to go to the store. I would hear some strange noises coming from his place from time to time. Sometimes out of nowhere, I would hear him yell out the F word and other curses. The walls there were thick, so I know he must have been yelling loud. I don't know for sure if it was a really bad anger problem, or maybe he was a passionate sports fan. I know some people get pretty into those games. Unfortunately, it seemed more like the former. One night, I was lying in bed. It wasn't that late, maybe it was around 8 o'clock. It wasn't completely dark out yet, but the sun was almost down. I was scrolling on my phone, and my balcony door was off to my left. Suddenly, I noticed something move out of the corner of my eye. It looked to be something outside my window. I put my phone down and turned to look, but it was gone. I thought it was a bird, but that was rare on the 18th floor in my city. After looking out the window for a minute, I gave up and forgot about it. Another night about a week later, I went out with some friends. I was the designated driver, so I didn't drink. When my friends were having their last round, though, I ordered a coffee just to make sure I would be awake enough to drive everyone home. Therefore, when I finally got to my place, I wasn't ready to go to sleep. I stayed up for about an hour watching TV, but when the clock struck 3 a.m., I decided it was time to go to bed. I still wasn't tired, though. By 4 a.m., I still couldn't fall asleep. That coffee seemed like a good idea at the time, but it was really keeping me up. I was lying on my side facing the window. The city skyline looked good at night, and I was watching it as I tried to doze off. Suddenly, I thought I noticed something. It was a blinking red light on the other side of my window, just to the side of my balcony. I watched it for a few seconds, not sure what I was seeing. It wasn't clear whether it was close or far away, but when it shifted up suddenly, I knew it was close. I rolled out of bed and walked over to the window. When I got there, I could see that it was a camera on some kind of a selfie stick, it seemed. Maybe it was a GoPro, or it could have been a regular camera, but I knew my neighbor was spying on me. Seconds after I saw it, it was jerked out of sight in the direction of Liam's apartment. I freaked out pretty hard right there and called the cops. To my shock, they didn't do anything right away. Apparently my word wasn't enough to search his place. I stayed with my mom for the next few days, because I was too scared to be at home. I was sure to tell my neighbors what he did, though. When I moved back to my apartment, Liam was still there, but fortunately, he didn't last long. I don't know how, but the cops finally managed to raid his place. The extent of what he was up to is not clear, but spying was not the only illegal stuff he was doing. The cyber crimes unit in my city was monitoring him as well. Once he was arrested, I never saw him again. I was allowed to see the footage he had of me, but I declined. There was no reason for me to do that to myself. The police also told me that they didn't believe he ever shared it publicly, so that was good for me. It's the worst thing that's ever happened to me, to have my privacy violated like that. Even though Liam was gone, I started looking for a new place right away. When my friend found out what happened, she was more than happy to let me break my lease. Before I bought my house, I lived in some sketchy places near some sketchy people. I could go on and on about some of the things that happened to me through my 20s and early 30s, but this one is the worst. I had a small apartment in an old building. That's where I lived when I finished high school. I was working at an auto shop doing oil changes mostly, and the pay was barely above minimum wage. Therefore, this was the only place I could afford without getting roommates, something I desperately wanted to avoid. My place was literally a single room, with a kitchen in one corner. My bed was right in the middle of the room, because there was no better place to put it, otherwise it would be blocking the door. I was happy enough at first, but the real problem was the neighbors. Since the building was old, you could hear everything. I don't know why old buildings are so bad like that. Maybe sound insulation wasn't invented yet, or maybe it was poor maintenance. All I know is that my apartment was constantly flooded with other people's conversations, footsteps, and every other noise you can imagine. My neighbors on one side were a married couple in their 30s. They were particularly loud, and they argued all the time, often late into the night. The man was Joshua, and he was a lawyer. The woman was Jane, and she was a receptionist. At the time when this happened, Joshua had been out of work for over a year. Money was one of the main things they fought over. Their fights became a regular thing that I would expect in my evenings, and I would often try to drown them out with music or TV shows. It wasn't just their yelling either. I would hear things being thrown occasionally as well. I could never tell if there was any physical violence, but I was always worried. Whenever I would see the two of them in public, it was like they were a perfect couple. They always put on a happy face for me and the others in the building, but we all knew what was going on behind closed doors, to some extent anyway. I could never understand why they did this. They must have known that people could hear them. I was never sure exactly how much to tolerate before calling the cops. I had never stepped in before this incident, but I was close a few times. About a month before this happened, I woke up in the middle of the night when one of them must have thrown something at the wall. It was a loud crash and a shatter, so I think it was a glass. I almost called the cops, but stopped, because things seemed to calm down soon after. Another night, they were arguing like usual. I remember sitting on my couch, trying to listen to some music, but the noise was so much that even my over-ear headphones couldn't stop it. I turned up the volume and managed to mostly ignore it for the next hour. By around 11, the noise had stopped. I was getting ready for bed, and I didn't hear anything else from them. By the time I went to bed, I figured they had done the same, because it was quiet. As I was laying there trying to sleep, I heard a sound that may have been a gunshot. Then a woman started crying. I knew it was Jane. For a moment, I lay there in shock. Then I got off my bed and laid on the floor for safety. I didn't know if these walls could stop a bullet. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my hands trembling as I explained what I heard. I remember my voice cracking as I spoke, and I tried to keep as quiet as possible so no one would hear me. The operator told me that help was on the way, and that I shouldn't do anything else. I followed their advice, moving away from the wall, which I shared with the couple. In the time since the gunshot, I heard crying and whimpering from Jane, but nothing from Joshua. It was an ominous feeling being there and listening. I kept praying that I would hear yelling again, but that never happened. With each passing second, I feared more and more that Joshua was dead. Soon later, I heard the cops approaching the building. The sound grew louder until it stopped right outside. I peeked through the window, saw police cars and an ambulance parked outside. I stayed away from my door, listening as the police knocked on the couple's apartment. It sounded like 10 or 20 people must have rushed into their place. Police, EMTs, and such. There were voices, but I wasn't listening closely. It was just standard police stuff anyway. Jane was crying and not making much sense. After some time, I heard Jane being escorted out of the building, but I couldn't tell if she was under arrest. The tension in the air was palpable, and I found myself pacing in the apartment, trying to calm down. The next day, I learned from another neighbor that the woman next door had in fact been arrested for shooting Joshua. I was called in as a witness because Jane claimed the shot was in self-defense. I thought that didn't make any sense because before the shot, it was basically silent. If it happened in the heat of a fight, then maybe self-defense would be believable. I told the cops what I heard, and several of my other neighbors did the same. Joshua was in serious condition for several weeks, but he eventually died of his injury. Based on my statements and several others, Jane was ultimately charged with murdering her husband. The trial is scheduled for early next year, but I'm hoping that I don't have to testify.